Okay, tonight we're not here for comfort. Tonight we're walking into a silence that never gave back its echoes. 3 women vanished in the stillness of a summer night, leaving behind only whispers of an unsolved mystery. Their absence still lingers like a shadow stretched across decades, haunting a small city in Missouri that never found closure. Darkness did not arrive with blood, nor with spectacle. It came quietly, stealing what could not be replaced, and leaving nothing but questions that still breathe beneath the surface. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts, but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said, and with the strange gravity of the human mind when it turns toward the unspeakable. In every case we cover, we move beyond the evidence and into the voids, the quiet spaces where psychology and philosophy attempt to explain what history left unsolved. Tonight, we return to a case still cold, still unresolved, still echoing. This is the story of the Springfield 3. Springfield, Missouri, in the early 1990s was the portrait of small-town America. On the surface, it looked calm, almost ordinary, a place where streets were lined with modest homes, children played in safe neighborhoods, and family bonds seemed strong. Yet behind appearances, every small town carries family secrets, pressures, and psychological fractures that remain invisible until they break. The case we are exploring begins with 3 women, forever known as the Springfield 3. They were not celebrities, nor people with enemies obvious to the outside world. They were ordinary, deeply human, and vulnerable. But sometimes, the most chilling mysteries emerge not from notorious criminals, but from the quiet disappearance of those who seemed safe. First was Cheryl Levitt, a woman of 47. She was a hairdresser by trade, disciplined, independent, and deeply protective of her daughter. Friends described her as strong-willed, reliable, and resilient. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, she carried the silent burdens of a single mother navigating divorce, economic struggles, and the relentless weight of maintaining order in her household. Cheryl Levitt embodied the psychological profile of many Midwestern women of her generation. She was independent, self-reliant, and accustomed to carrying the weight of responsibility without complaint. Yet her resilience was not invulnerability. Beneath her competence lay a trust in her community, a belief that Springfield was predictable enough to provide safety. But safety in small towns is often an illusion, a fragile veil stretched over the chaos of the human condition. It is the quiet assumption that danger always lives elsewhere, until it does not. Her daughter, Suzanne "Susie" Streeter, stood at a threshold where youth collides with adulthood. At 19, she had just graduated from Kickapoo High School. Her future was unwritten, filled with possibilities and contradictions. She was charismatic and kind, yet sometimes restless, testing the boundaries of her independence. Friends remembered her energy, but also the shadows of complicated relationships, including a young man who would later face criminal charges. That history clung to her story like a faint but troubling echo, a detail that in hindsight seemed more ominous than it once appeared. Susie's close friend, Stacy McCall, completed the trio. Also 19, Stacy was often described as gentle, reliable, and grounded, the steady counterbalance to Susie's more rebellious nature. On the night of her disappearance, her plans were simple: spend time with friends after graduation, then head home. Instead, circumstance redirected her steps into Susie's house. Unlike Susie, she carried no troubled ties, no shadow of enemies or strained connections. Her fate was bound not by her own choices, but by her loyalty, by the simple act of staying with a friend. Together, Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy formed a fragile constellation of vulnerability. Cheryl represented maturity and quiet trust. Susie embodied restless defiance, and Stacy carried the innocence of stability. None of them seemed destined for violence, yet their very ordinariness makes the case haunting. In Springfield, community felt both comforting and claustrophobic. People believed they knew one another, but such certainty often conceals deeper shadows. Small-town crimes disturb us not because they are frequent, but because they rupture the illusion of safety we thought unshakable. When examining this background, we must remember that danger rarely appears without roots. It grows silently in neglected relationships, in fractured minds, in community members whose pain or rage remains unseen. For Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy, the central question is not only what happened to them, but why Springfield failed to protect its own. Psychological archetypes help illuminate the roles they embodied. Cheryl was the guardian, anchoring her family against instability. Susie was the seeker, restless and exposed to risks. Stacy was the innocent, swept into a fate that was not hers to bear. In Jungian terms, they became a tragic triad: the protector, the wanderer, and the unsuspecting victim. Susie had previously testified against a young man involved in vandalism, an act that created friction in a town where grudges could linger. Cheryl, meanwhile, was balancing her daughter's volatility with her own private struggles. Strong mothers often radiate security, yet projection is never true immunity. Stacy's life was far simpler, yet her decision to spend the night at Susie A.'s home placed her in the wrong place at the wrong time. Randomness, in criminology, often collides with intent. A crime may begin with one intended target, but chance expands the circle of victims. In this case, that chance sealed Stacy's fate. The Springfield community saw these women as reflections of ordinary life. They were not isolated, reckless, or entangled in crime, and yet it is their normalcy that makes the silence unbearable. Their absence shows us how stability can shatter without warning, how entire lives can be consumed by disappearance without explanation. When psychologists and criminologists study such cases, they always look backward. What fractures were already visible? What bonds were already fragile? The disappearance of the Springfield Three is not only a single act of violence, but a collision of psychology, community, and fate. It mirrors both personal vulnerabilities and the collective blindness of those who believed danger did not belong here. Some theorists suggest that small towns hide more darkness than cities because secrecy thrives where trust is assumed. Familiarity becomes camouflage. Neighbors believe they know each other, and so they overlook what is hidden in plain sight. In Springfield, the illusion of safety provided the perfect cover for a predator who understood invisibility as a form of control. Thus, Part 1 is not just a presentation of characters, but a stage set for tragedy. On that stage stood a protective mother, a restless daughter, and an unsuspecting friend. Around them, a town confident in its own stability. Beneath them, the cracks of tension, obsession, and the timeless capacity for human violence. As we move forward, hold these identities close. Cheryl, the resilient; Susie, the restless; Stacy, the innocent. They are not just names, but psychological archetypes. Their lives remind us that crimes are not born in moments, but in shadows, in relationships, and in human silence. The timeline of June 6, 1992 began innocently, with celebration. Graduation was a threshold, a symbolic bridge from adolescence into adulthood. For Suzanne Susie Streeter and her friend Stacy McCall, the night was supposed to be carefree. Parties, laughter, and a final ritual of youth before responsibilities pressed in. No one suspected this joyous passage would dissolve into mystery. The girls' original plan was simple: spend the night at another friend's house after the celebrations. Yet fatigue redirected them. Instead, they decided to return to Susie's home on East Delmar Street, where her mother, Cheryl Levitt, had finished a late shift. A minor choice, casual at the time, but in the anatomy of tragedy, small pivots often become decisive. The three women converged in Cheryl's modest single-story home. From the street, it was the image of suburban reassurance. A porch light glowing, a tidy yard, neighbors confident enough to leave doors unlocked. Yet it was here, in this quiet facade of safety, that the traces of their lives stopped. Morning revealed absence. Susie's red Ford Escort, Stacy's Toyota Corolla, and Cheryl's Corsica sat undisturbed outside. Inside, the house preserved stillness. Purses, keys, cigarettes, even cash remained untouched. There was no broken furniture, no forced entry, no blood. The women had vanished, leaving behind their lives mid-sentence. One irregularity stood out. The porch light's glass globe lay shattered. A neighbor, assuming triviality, swept it away. Yet criminology teaches that seemingly minor disruptions can hold disproportionate weight. Was it broken in struggle? by design to darken the entrance, or coincidence? Its ambiguity remains symbolic of the case itself. The telephone offered another disquieting clue. Friends who called that morning reported hearing bizarre, obscene messages from an unidentified male. Whether this was a cruel prank coinciding with the disappearance or a deliberate intrusion connected to the crime remains unsolved. In mysteries, uncertainty itself becomes a form of evidence, contaminating every ordinary detail with suspicion. By midday, anxiety hardened into fear. Stacy failed to appear for a water park trip she had carefully planned. Susie ignored calls. Cheryl missed work, something utterly uncharacteristic. Slowly, the realization took hold. 3 women tethered to responsibility and routine had simply disappeared. When police were finally contacted, the crime scene had already been compromised. Friends and relatives, panicked and desperate, had entered the home repeatedly. They tidied, picked up phones, shifted objects. Their instinct to help inadvertently erased potential forensic traces. What might have been pristine was instead blurred by compassion. This collision between human urgency and investigative necessity is a common tragedy in unsolved cases. The timeline itself holds clarity and void. The last confirmed sighting placed Susie and Stacy leaving a party shortly after 2 a.m. By 9 a.m., they were absent. Within those few hours lies the heart of the mystery, a hidden act so precise it left no visible scar. Psychologically, this absence is its own violence. Crimes typically announce themselves in chaos: blood, broken locks, overturned rooms. Here, the violence was silence. Such erasure suggests planning, control, and psychological dominance. It was not impulsive rage, but deliberate invisibility. Investigators faced 2 possibilities: a random predator seizing opportunity, or a targeted act rooted in relationships, grudges, or buried secrets. Yet the disappearance of 3 women simultaneously without trace leans toward calculation rather than spontaneity. Neighbors heard nothing unusual. No screams, no commotion. Even dogs remained quiet. Either the entry was smooth and controlled, or the community failed to register what was happening in their midst. The stillness of that night magnified the terror. If such an act could unfold unnoticed, then safety itself had always been illusion. The possessions left behind deepened the puzzle. This was not burglary. Money, jewelry, and vehicles were untouched. The target was human lives. Psychologically, this reveals a perpetrator interested not in objects but in control, possession, and dominance. Rumors proliferated. Some pointed to Susie's prior testimony against a young man tied to vandalism, potentially linking her to criminal circles. Others speculated about a stranger exploiting suburban vulnerability. With no evidence, theories became coping mechanisms, filling the void facts refused to occupy. The profiles of the victims made voluntary disappearance unthinkable. Cheryl was steady and dependable, Susie ambitious but grounded, and Stacy responsible, with no reason to vanish. Their simultaneous absence pointed only to external force. For investigators, the phrase "last seen alive" became haunting, repeated as friends replayed the final party. Laughter, fatigue, and the choice to go home, details magnified in hindsight. As trauma transforms the ordinary into ominous signs. Yet answers never came. Days stretched into silence while flyers multiplied, cameras arrived, and speculation grew. The Delmar Street house, once an ordinary suburban home, became a symbol of loss, a monument not of violence seen but of absence, its quietness echoing louder than any evidence. From a criminological perspective, the efficiency of the act is telling. To remove 3 women without resistance, forensic trace or neighborhood disruption required planning and confidence. This was not clumsy violence, but controlled execution. The strangeness of the case is precisely its silence. Nothing broken, nothing stolen, only lives erased. Here lies the paradox. The house was full of traces, personal belongings, unfinished routines, and yet it was hollow, stripped of clarity. It was as if someone had excised not only the women, but the narrative itself, leaving ambiguity in place of evidence. The night can be divided into 3 movements: before, celebration; youth, joy; during, invisibility, the hidden act. After, confusion, silence, and a community awakening to fear. The crime exists entirely in that invisible middle, the hours no one can reconstruct. For Springfield, the disappearance was both intimate tragedy and collective rupture. From that summer onward, neighbors locked doors, abandoned complacency, and accepted vulnerability. The mythology of small-town safety dissolved overnight. And so the timeline stands cold. At 2 a.m., 3 women returned home. By dawn, they were gone. Their cars, their possessions, their lives lingered like echoes. What happened in those silent hours remains the void at the center of one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The disappearance of 3 women at once demanded immediate investigation. Yet the earliest hours, critical in any case, were already compromised. Friends and family, driven by panic and care, entered the home repeatedly, unknowingly erasing potential evidence. Forensic clarity was lost to human fear. From that moment, the case carried a permanent flaw. When law enforcement entered the Levitt home, the scene was deceptively ordinary. Rooms were neat, possessions untouched, and no signs of forced entry or struggle appeared. Yet the very absence of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy amid cars in the driveway and purses left behind transformed normalcy into dread. Investigators faced a further obstacle. The home had been entered by worried friends and family before police arrived, inadvertently disturbing potential evidence. Footprints, fingerprints, and subtle traces that might have guided the investigation were clouded beyond recovery. The Springfield Police Department soon came under scrutiny. Residents argued the initial response lacked urgency. Valuable hours passed before the neighborhood was canvassed or the home properly secured. In criminology, such lapses are sometimes described as evidence ignored, small failures that magnify over time. Detectives worked through competing theories. Some favored the idea of a stranger abduction, while others focused on acquaintances, including a man linked to Susie through a prior vandalism case. Retaliation was possible, though unproven. Another possibility was a stalker, someone who had studied the women, planned carefully, and struck with precision. Meanwhile, the media amplified the mystery. Local worry became national fascination, headlines branding the case as a chilling enigma of vanishing without trace. Public reaction grew intense. Citizens of Springfield volunteered in searches, distributed flyers, and held vigils. Families that once left doors unlocked began installing locks and lights. Fear spread like contagion. In psychology, this reflects collective trauma. The community absorbs the victimization of a few and reshapes its behavior in response. Tip lines flooded with information. Some calls were sincere, others cruel hoaxes. One lead claimed the women had been buried beneath a hospital parking garage. Excavation was considered but later dismissed due to cost and lack of evidence. The rumor persisted, however, a ghostly possibility that haunted residents for decades. Witness interviews offered little clarity. Some recalled vehicles parked near the house that night. Others spoke of unfamiliar men lingering at parties. But none of the accounts formed a coherent narrative. Memory shaped by fear and time is unreliable. Investigators struggled to separate fact from projection, truth from suggestion. The FBI joined the case, bringing resources and expertise. Yet even federal involvement yielded little progress. Without forensic evidence, without reliable witnesses, and without a confession, the investigation became an exercise in assembling fragments that refused to connect. Each theory seemed reasonable, yet none rose above conjecture. Psychologically, the investigators themselves became part of the story. In high-profile cases, police feel pressure not only to solve the crime but to protect the reputation of the institution. Errors in the first days magnified this tension. Some officers defended their actions, while others quietly admitted opportunities had been lost forever. For the families, the investigation was an agony of waiting. Cheryl's relatives clung to hope, but sensed the worst. Stacy's parents appeared on television, pleading for information, their voices heavy with desperation. Hope and despair alternated daily, creating a psychological roller coaster that eroded strength. The absence of closure is its own form of torment. The town itself split into camps. Some believed the women had been taken by strangers passing through Springfield. Others insisted the crime had roots within the community. Suspicion turned inward, breeding mistrust. Neighbors who once shared coffee began to wonder who among them could harbor such darkness. Over time, the case acquired layers of mythology. It was no longer only about facts, but about fear, rumor, and narrative. The Springfield Three became more than missing persons. They became symbols of vulnerability. In storytelling terms, they were characters in a tragedy written not by fate, but by human malice and human error. Investigators pursued countless leads. Psychics offered visions. Inmates offered confessions. Suspects were interrogated, yet none charged. Each false lead drained resources and focus. Each disappointment hardened the sense of futility. The case grew colder with every passing month, as the trail turned into a collection of unanswered questions. Media coverage shaped public perception. Some outlets portrayed the women as pure victims, symbols of innocence. Others hinted at hidden connections, secret relationships, or reckless choices. This duality, victim or accomplice, reflected society's tendency to assign blame, even subtly, to those who suffer. It exposed cultural discomfort with randomness and vulnerability. Sociologically, Springfield became a study in fear. Parents imposed stricter curfews. Teenagers learned mistrust earlier than usual. Local businesses used the case in whispered cautionary tales. The disappearance was not only unsolved, it was a narrative wound, reopening each time the story resurfaced in newspapers or late-night discussions. Years passed, and anniversaries came and went. Each June, the local press revisited the case. Candlelight vigils were held, photographs displayed. Yet with every year, the likelihood of resolution diminished. Cold cases operate like fading signals. The longer they remain unsolved, the weaker the connection to truth becomes. Still, the investigation continued. Detectives kept files open, reviewed tips, re-examined evidence with newer technology. But the foundational problem remained. The scene had been compromised. No fingerprints, no DNA, no clear physical trail. It is difficult to illuminate a mystery when the first light was dimmed at its very beginning. The Springfield Three case thus became a paradox. It was both intensely public and perpetually opaque. Everyone knew the story, yet no one knew the truth. It symbolized the fragility of certainty, how even in a world of law and order, silence can overpower evidence. In this silence, suspicion and fear multiplied. As we transition from the investigation to psychological insight, we carry this paradox. Law enforcement faced criticism. The media amplified the story. The public lived with fear and families endured torment. Yet the crime itself remains invisible. And invisibility, for both investigators and communities, is the most unsettling enemy of all. The Springfield Three case is remembered not only for its absence of resolution, but for the psychological questions it forces us to confront. When three people vanish without trace, the crime ceases to be a simple act of violence. It becomes a mirror reflecting the mindset of whoever orchestrated the disappearance. A killer's mindset is not merely about cruelty, it is about control. To remove three individuals simultaneously, without leaving evidence, requires planning, confidence, and a desire to dominate. This is not the profile of impulsive aggression, but of someone whose psychology was shaped by secrecy, patience, and the quiet cultivation of power. In trauma psychology, silence itself becomes an instrument. Victims are erased, families are silenced, communities live under the weight of unanswered questions. For Springfield, the trauma was collective. Every parent imagined their own child disappearing. Every neighbor wondered if familiarity itself was a mask. Safety dissolved into permanent suspicion. Philosophically, this case invites us to consider the nature of evil. The Stoics believed events are indifferent until interpreted. Yet what interpretation can one give to the erasure of three women? It resists reason, reminding us that some acts lie outside logic, emerging from the darker impulses that exist in human nature. From a Christian perspective, disappearance echoes absence of light, the withdrawal of divine presence. Evil here is not loud but silent, not explosive but empty. It is the theft of being itself, denying families the closure of mourning. To grieve without bodies is to grieve in limbo, a psychological purgatory without end. Buddhist philosophy frames suffering as attachment to what cannot be held. Families of the Springfield Three endured precisely that, attachment to hope, to images, to possibilities. Each anniversary deepened suffering because release was impossible. Without truth, detachment becomes cruel, a demand no parent or child can easily fulfill. Confucian thought values order, filial duty, and social harmony. This crime violated all three. It removed a mother, a daughter, and a friend in one stroke, disrupting generational continuity and tearing at the fabric of community trust. Harmony fractured, replaced by suspicion. The crime became more than disappearance. It was disorder incarnate. Psychological profiling of potential perpetrators suggests several possibilities. One is organized predation, a calculated offender with experience in control and concealment. Another is opportunistic rage, masked later by the efficiency of cleanup. Both imply a mind capable of compartmentalization, where violence is justified internally while hidden externally behind normalcy. Some investigators believe the crime was personal. Susie's earlier testimony against a young man may have seeded revenge. If so, the psychological driver was humiliation. To reclaim power, an offender humiliated by public exposure may attempt to assert dominance by erasing the witness. In such psychology, disappearance is punishment and warning combined. Others argue the act was opportunistic, committed by someone stalking vulnerable women. Here the psychology aligns with predatory obsession, the kind studied in criminology as dark fixation. Such individuals live double lives, outwardly unremarkable while inwardly consumed by fantasies of control. For them, crime is not chaos, but fulfillment of narrative. The absence of forensic evidence suggests not only planning but knowledge of investigative blind spots. Did the perpetrator know police response times? Did they understand how contamination of the scene would weaken forensic possibilities? Such awareness suggests either prior experience or careful study. In either case, the psychological signature is deliberate, not accidental. For the community, aftermath was transformation. Springfield, once a place of unlocked doors, became a town of suspicion. This shift illustrates secondary victimization, where entire populations alter behaviors because of trauma. Fear of the unknown becomes a permanent resident, altering identity of place. The crime did not end in one night. It lives on. For the families, aftermath is endless liminality. In psychology, ambiguous loss is the most destabilizing grief. To lose someone without confirmation of death denies the rituals of closure. There are no funerals, no graves, only anniversaries and speculation. This keeps trauma alive indefinitely, recycling pain into each year that passes without answers. From a criminological view, even decades later, new approaches remain possible. Modern DNA techniques could re-examine traces invisible to investigators in the early 1990s, while geospatial mapping might reinterpret witness accounts, revealing overlooked patterns. Cold cases rarely break open through sudden revelations. Rather, persistence and the steady application of evolving methods renew their possibilities. Yet psychology warns that even if solved, the aftermath does not vanish. Knowing who or why cannot undo 30 years of grief. Families might gain closure, but closure is not healing. Healing requires integration, accepting a truth almost unbearable, that safety was never absolute, only fragile. The Springfield Three also compel deeper reflection. Why does this case linger while others fade? The answer lies in its narrative power. A mother, her daughter, and a friend disappearing together feels archetypal, almost mythic. It endures not just as crime, but as symbol. Symbolically, it embodies the vulnerability of women in society. Their erasure reflects patterns of patriarchal control, echoing centuries of disappearance in both myth and history. The psychology of whoever committed the act cannot be separated from that wider cultural context of dominance and erasure. Yet the ultimate question persists: why did they do it? Motives may range from revenge to obsession, but deeper still lies the possibility of meaninglessness. Some crimes occur not to express purpose but to indulge compulsion. For investigators and philosophers alike, this is the hardest truth, that some actions resist explanation. As decades pass, Silence remains the loudest evidence. Silence in the house on Delmar Street. Silence in the files that never yielded breakthrough. Silence in the families who endure absence instead of presence. That silence is both the aftermath and the essence of the crime. Sometimes the loudest sound is what never came. And so the psychological insight brings us back to stillness. The Springfield Three are gone. Their names live, their faces remain in photographs, their memory haunts. Yet the mind of their abductor remains shadowed. Whether it was revenge, obsession, or opportunistic cruelty, the truth is hidden, preserved in silence stronger than confession. If fear is a mirror, then the Springfield Three reflect the vulnerabilities we try to forget. They remind us that safety is fragile, trust is uncertain, and even the most ordinary night can fracture into mystery. This is not simply an unsolved case. It is a wound that never healed. The disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacey McCall is more than tragedy. It is a reminder of the silence within human violence. In that silence lives our deepest terror, that truth itself can vanish and justice may never arrive. As you leave this story, carry the question with you. What do we fear more, the crime itself, or the possibility that its answer remains buried forever? Remember to like, share the video, and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden psychology of crime. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.
References 1. Linder, D., 2002. The Springfield Three Case Files. Springfield Archives. Point 2. Johnson, M., 2015. Cold Cases of the Midwest. Chicago Press. Point 3. Smith, R., 2020. Unsolved America, True Crime's Dark Past. HarperCollins.